Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another COVID-19 webinar brought to you by the National Institute for Occupational Health, the NIOH. I am Ashraf Raycliffe, the National Occupational Health and Safety Training Manager, and I come to you from a very cold and chilly Johannesburg. The topic today for our webinar is COVID-19 droplets versus aerosols and ventilation. The role of ventilation in the workplace. Essentially, if I understand my more scientific colleagues and the technical expertise within the NIH, this is about exposure science. And I think we've got two good presenters today that's going to deal with that concept. And I'm sure when Prof Brouwer is going to be speaking, he would be able to correct me on that exposure science comment. So yes, welcome. We normally have our colleague, Dr. Tanusha Singh, to do the opening remarks as per the program. One moment. And unfortunately, she is occupied in another very important obligation within the NIH and is unable to join us. Dr. Tanusha Singh is the head of our COVID-19 Occupational Health Outbreak Response Team. That's the COVID-19 OWAR team, as well as the head of the Immunology and Microbiology section here at the NIH. So by way of introduction, the NIH is a specialized division of the National Health Laboratory Services and a sister division of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. So we're delighted to bring this webinar to you on the question of droplets and aerosols. And the two speakers, that is Professor Derk Brouwer, who's going to be dealing with the historical basis of the aerosol droplet discussion, and followed by Kevin Renton, who's going to deal with the practical implications and the measurement of ventilation in rooms. Now, we have dealt with this topic before in a previous webinar, and we hope that this webinar is going to expand our understanding of this element of the important prevention and workplace preparedness around all other hazards, in particular COVID-19. Okay, so just a quick few virtual house rules. With large numbers of webinar attendees, we do not have your microphones activated other than the presenters and their video and file sharing. We are going to, as well as the microphones, we may, depending on time, have that feature activated towards the end, subject to availability of time. But we are going to encourage you to please type all your questions in the question and answer box. That's the Q&A box. It's the two speech bubbles icons at the bottom of your Zoom box or your Zoom screen. If you click on there, it'll open the Q&A box. If you double click, it'll open separately. And then you can type in the first column your question. The presenters will see your questions. If it's answered, it'll move over to the other tabs or columns. For non-questions, meaning questions not for the content of the presentations, other admin and general comments, please type that in the chat box. I will be monitoring both boxes. But again, an appeal to you, please do not type your questions for the presenters in the chat box. Type your questions for the presenters in the question and answer box. That'll be much appreciated. I will remind those colleagues who might perhaps be doing something different to copy and paste their question from the chat box into the question and answer box. So thank you for joining us today. This is the COVID-19 webinar brought to you by the National Institute for Occupational Health, the NIOH, and by our first speaker is Prof Derk Brouwer. And by way of introduction, Professor Brouwer is a distinguished professor in the Division of Occupational Health at the WITS School of Public Health and is an NFR A2 rated exposure scientist. And he's been had the NRF rating since 2017. He has a chemical engineering degree and is trained and certified occupational hygienist. And that is through the NVVA in the Netherlands and SIO, the professional body, South African Institute for Occupational Hygiene in South Africa. Prof Brouwer received his PhD degree from Utrecht University in the Netherlands with a thesis focused on occupational exposure to agrochemicals. Prior to his current position, he's a senior scientist in exposure assessment with the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research, TNO, and a coordinator and principal scientist and work package leader in various European projects on nanosafety and health. Prof Brouwer's research is in the field of exposure science and focuses on the human interaction with the environment and occupational stresses. Research topics that he focuses on are measurement strategies, occupational and residential exposure modeling, exposure prevention and control strategies, life cycle driven risk assessment, risk mitigation, and the safety of nanomaterials. With that introduction, I'm going to ask Prof to open his microphone and to share his slides. I'm not sure if you may want to add anything to the introduction, Professor. I am just wanting to thank you for taking the time to join us on the webinar and to share your knowledge and experience with our audience on this topic, and for getting ready with your presentation. And whilst Prof is doing that, a quick reminder to everybody. Again, please type your questions in the question and answer box. That's the Q&A box, the two speech bubbles at the bottom. And your general comments, please, if you could do that in the chat box. Okay, so Prof, if you could just click the green share button at the bottom. There we go. I can see your slide is maximized on the screen, and I see that your microphone is unmuted. I'm going to hand over to you immediately.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashraf. Yes, I'm a little bit privileged because I'm in the Nordic hemisphere, so it's a little bit more nice temperatures here. But anyhow, so this morning will be a little bit on the ongoing discussions between the virologists and the aerosol scientists on aerosol and droplet transmission of COVID-19. And that's important to address because this is more or less the backbone of a very important non-pharmaceutical intervention to reduce the transmission of COVID-19. It's the social distancing. That is quite important that we actually know what is the background of this kind of intervention and rules. So I would like to start with a disclaimer in a way that I'm not a virologist, I'm not a aerosol scientist, I'm an exposure scientist and occupational hygienist. So that's my perspective, my view to look at this. So it means that I show you and present not anything from my original work, but others. But I think it's good to get an overview of what has been published so far in this particular field. So maybe we can start with this. This is claimed to be world's shortest horror movie. It was uploaded in the early days of the pandemic in February 2020, and hopefully it's gonna work. I'm not sure. We haven't tested it. Ashraf, I'm not sure how I'm gonna activate it.
Yeah, I think you must just double click on the actual video.
No, it doesn't work.
No, that's your slides functions. But the video is an embedded video, and yeah, if you want to, I can perhaps quickly play it from my side.
Well, it's just, I mean, maybe participants can have a look later on. So here's the address. But it shows that at that particular period, everything was focused on droplets, and that's quite interesting to see how things have evolved over this in time. So. This is a poster which was issued during the Spanish flu pandemic in the 1917, 1980s, and it shows that the focus again was for public awareness, how to reduce transmission by focusing on the prevention of droplet emission or the reduction by droplet emissions by things like using your handkerchiefs or to cover your mouth during coughing, etc. So that is in the 1980s. So 1 century later, we have a poster which was issued in August last year by the US CDC, and this is much alike the poster that was presented 100 years ago. So it's very much on cover your cough and sneeze, and wash your hands, keep distance, and stay at home when you feel sick. So that is interesting to see how this was addressed in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's all about based on the paradigm of transmission, where we have an index person or a infected person who actually emits either by coughing, sneezing, or even speaking or breathing droplets that have a virus load. And we have a person who is the receptor, which could be on a short distance of the infected person or a long distance or further distance. And here we have, say, a number of potential exposure pathways which are distinguished in droplet-borne route. We have the short-range airborne route, and we have the long-range airborne route. And in between, we have something like the fomite route, where the surface is contaminated by the index person, and the receptor touches that particular surface and then transferred it to mouth or whatever part of the body. Interesting here, and this is a publication in the American Journal of Infection Control in 2016, is that, maybe you can see it at the bottom, they stated that small droplets or droplet nuclei or aerosols, which are smaller than 5 micrometer, are responsible for the long-range airborne route here. So that's interesting to see. And especially in the early days, or say last year, so the early days of the pandemic, there was quite a controversial or a debate between, on the one hand, public health agencies like the World Health Organization and CDC versus the aerosol science community, And basically the issues were around what is the most dominant transmission pathway? Is it droplets, or is it aerosol, or is it short range versus long range? And the second part was very much on what definition is, and the definition that was an aerosol was given as a particle smaller than 5 micrometers. So there was a specific cut-off size. So last year, the end of last year and early this year, there were two interesting publications published that looked at the the origins of the social distancing rule, or 1 or 2 meters, and also on the definition of the aerosols that was used by the public health agencies. So the first paper that I would like to draw attention to is the paper published by Jones and colleagues in the British Medical Journal. It was the end of 2020, and it was entitled 2 meters or 1, what is the evidence for physical distancing in COVID-19? The second paper, more recent paper, was posted late April this year, is by Kevin Renton and collaborators, and it is entitled "How Did We Get Here? What are droplets and aerosols, and how far do they go? A historical perspective on the transmission of respiratory infectious diseases." And it's a quite interesting paper, which goes back in the early days of the research and the input from research in public health. Actually, the authors came up with interesting findings that especially William Wells, which is quite famous researcher in the field of infection diseases, stated that it's not just what is suspended in air, but what is truly infectious is based on the ability to reach the deepest lungs. And here some sizes, particle sizes were mentioned. And this was more or less adopted by another quite famous scientist, Alexander Langmuir, who stated that droplet size is relevant because of where the aerosols are deposited in the lungs. And here it was also mentioned and distinguished that there are large droplets and aerosols. And again, the 5 micrometer cutoff was mentioned here. So the issues here were that based on this, that there was something which was implemented from this in non-pharmaceutical interventions, and said that say larger droplets based on ballistic properties, they cannot travel very much, so they will actually fall out on a short range of the infected person. So that is more or less the basis for social distancing. However, since it was also based on historical studies, these studies also showed some limitations, because in most cases, to look at the aerosol or the droplet formation, optical techniques were used, and they had limited resolution. And the position of the droplets was based on the colony growing plates, and they usually had short sampling times. So that means that the settling of smaller particles was not actually measured. And also, there was, in this case, a threshold for infection dose, which was taken as the standard that was based on TB infection. So there are some limitations of this historical studies, although they were the best available at that moment, of course. So this is a figure taken from the paper by Jones, where on the left side there is an optical or a visualization of a sneeze from a study in 1942 using the techniques that were available at that time. But Jones and others, they did some work. And they actually used also optical techniques where they actually shown that such a sneeze or cough, it forms a quite complicated cloud or jet of droplets that can travel as far as 7-8 meters. So that's quite different from the early studies. So yeah, so you can actually say that there is there are different fields, different communities in the field of infection diseases and the transmission. We have the virology, and we have the aerosol science. The virologists, they put more emphasis on the droplet fate and the receptor. So that's the reason that this 5 micrometer was really the smaller particles that could reach the alveoli at the receptor, where the aerosol science focuses on what particles or droplets are emitted, what is their sizes, but actually what happens during transport. And so far, communication between the two fields was quite limited. However, interesting that in this year there was a study or a paper published in the Journal of Hospital Infection, where many of these authors were quite famous aerosol scientists. So we have Lydia Moravsky here, we have William Nazaroff. So these are Gianni Buonanno. So these are quite famous aerosol scientists. And they published a study or a paper which was entitled Dismantling Myths on the Airborne Transmission of Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And so they had actually 10 myths, but 2 of them are shown in this, and they actually address the topic of today. So the first myth was that the virologists or the clinicians, they use the terminology that aerosols are droplets with a diameter of 5 micrometer or less, and the second is that all particles larger than that particular size will fall within a 1 to 2 meter of the source. So these are quite important myths that are actually the basis of many of the non-pharmaceutical interventions that form the backbone of the transmission prevention. So in this table, they show that there is, although we have the same terminology, in different fields, it has another meaning. So in the field of the clinicians, an aerosol is indeed defined or described as particles below 5 micrometer, whereas in aerosol science, an aerosol is any solid or liquid particle that is suspended in a gas, and in our case in air, and it's independent of size. So everything, any particle suspended in air is called an aerosol. Then there is this is the distinguishing between aerosols and droplets that is used in the field of the clinicians or the virologists. That droplets are particles above or larger than 5 micrometers that falls rapidly to the ground within a distance of 1 to 2 meters. In aerosol science, a droplet is just a liquid particle. Yeah. So, and it can also be an aerosol, of course, because if a liquid particle is suspended in a gas, it becomes an aerosol. So, but size is important. We should not forget it. And of course, if we look at the right side of this slide, we look at the infected person or the source person, or it could be any person, because it's not it's quite generic. It's not depending on having any disease or symptoms. It's just what happens during some activities like breathing, like speaking, also a little bit, or of course, sneezing and coughing. So at the right side, we see that the droplet or particle size that is generated by the person is very much depending on the location where it originates from and where it's generated. So the smaller particles are generated in the upper parts of the lung and in the bronchial section. The slightly larger particles are generated in the larynx region, and then in the mouth, the generation of the larger particles takes place. So this is the particle size distribution at the source. At the receptor, so a person that might say receive these droplets that are emitted by the source, the deposition and the efficacy of deposition of the droplets or the particles suspended in the air are also size depending. So the smallest particles can actually enter into the deepest part of the lungs, the alveoli. The slightly larger particles will deposit in the upper parts of the lung, whereas the larger particles that are still inhalable will deposit in the mouth and nose region. So it demonstrates that particle size is an important factor. However, it's not that we distinguish between an aerosol and a droplet based on particle size only. So in quite recently, there are more, say, sophisticated approaches looking at what's happening from the receptor to the from the source to the receptor in the transport of these particles by using aerosol dynamics and aerosol dynamics modeling. And this is a paper published by Dewan and Biswas. It's still in press in the environmental science and technology. So this is just a picture, again, showing a little bit the source receptor model, where we have an emission here of a number of and a size distribution of droplets that become aerosols when they are suspended in the air. The larger aerosols will settle down quite rapidly, because of the change of particle size, because of evaporation, some of these aerosols will remain in the air quite long, and would be responsible for a long-term exposure. So it can be inhaled by a receptor person and then deposit. So based on this, they come up with some using aerosol dynamics with some modeling of what is the distance that actually droplets can travel. And one of the previous slides showed this visualization where it already indicates that particles can travel quite far. So here they have distinguished two particle sizes, 10 micrometer, initial particle sizes, 10 micrometer, and 100 micrometer. And they modeled it for a specific environmental condition with relative humidity of 50%. And there were two, say, generating activities, particle generating activities. One was speaking, and the other was coughing, sneezing. And that's important because, on one hand, it shows that these activities indicate where the main location of the generation of the particles in the lungs or in the source person are, but also it affects the initial velocity of the emission. So in this picture, it's shown that the larger particles above 100 of 100 micrometer will still fall in a distance of 1.6 meter if only speaking is considered. So this is confirms the rules that have been implemented on social distancing of 1 to 2 meters or 6 feet. However, with coughing and sneezing, it is quite different already, because here they can actually settle at a distance of about 5 meters. But when we look at the smaller particles, already speaking will give a prolonged settling time, but also a prolonged distance from the source of about 9 meters, and coughing and sneezing even at a distance of 27 meters. So that's quite important here. So this is the initial droplet size. This is the final droplet size at time of settling. So in between the emission and the deposition, there's something happening, and here the environment conditions, and especially the relative humidity, are very important. This is a picture taken from a publication by Liu in 2016, and it shows that the droplet that is emitted by the source is actually a mixture of nuclei and a liquid. And during the suspension and travel in the air, it will be affected by the relative humidity or the evaporation of the liquid part here. So this is an example where this particular droplets that of 10 and 100 micrometer, this initial size, will evaporate at different relative humidities. So a 100 micrometer droplet at a 95% relative humidity will only evaporate after 100 seconds, where at a very low relative humidity, a 10 micrometer droplet will already evaporate in 2 seconds. So in general, the dried out droplet size, or aerosol size more precisely, when it's suspended in air, will be about, well, between 10 and 40%. So take on average 30% of the initial droplet size. So it is important to distinguish what is the initial droplet size and what is the resulting droplet size at the level of the receptor. So implications are that droplets generated by both, well, in symptomatic and asymptomatic affected persons can travel beyond 2 meters in the air. And the initial size will actually decrease depending on environmental conditions and may be remain suspended for several hours. So that is a very important issue to consider. So if we try to summarize this source receptor model and what are the important parameters, it's a little bit like this. So we have a source, which actually is the emission of aerosolized sputum and saliva. And it could be done by symptomatic or asymptomatic persons, by sneezing, coughing, and speaking and breathing. So that particular parameter affects the initial particle size distribution of what is emitted, the initial particle velocity, and of course, depending on this, the quanta rate. So what is the infective load or the viral load here. Then we have transport, so it's from source to receptor, where we have emission, transmission, and emission. Transport, an important parameter here is the environment conditions, like relative humidity, temperature, and the air velocity in the environment, but also ventilation, and I mentioned here the air exchange rate. So this will affect the evaporation rate, as I shown, the deposition rate, the final particle size distribution, but also virus inactivation rate, and of course ventilation very much. It affects the loss. So what disappears during the transport? So then at the receptor side, what is important parameter here is the distance to the source, of course. Then it's the activity pattern or the breathing rate of the receptor, because that will affect the lung deposition efficacy. The distance to the source, there we have the concentration in the breathing zone, and the duration, of course, is an important part of any exposure. So that are the most relevant parameters in this source receptor model. So it's more or less a revisiting of the paradigm that I showed you earlier. So here we have a number of the parameters that actually are relevant in the source receptor model that are listed here. And I have now removed the 5 micrometer size cutoff to distinguish droplets and aerosol. As I told you, in the field of aerosol science, there is no size dependency of the definition of an aerosol. Okay, so these source receptor models parameters have been used to elaborate on a modeling of the risk, a quantitative modeling. It was first published early in 2020 by this group of Buonanni and Morasca and Stabile. So they came up with the first quantitative estimate, risk estimate. And it was followed by other papers that were published a little bit later. One of this was, I already mentioned, a paper by Dwewan and Biswas. So the latter group, they published a study, and this is a figure where they actually show what is the effect of separation and initial velocity. So in this graph, we see on the y-axis the risk of infection, and here we see the time. And the risk is a function of time here, but it's depending on different issues related to the emission. And one is, of course, the initial velocity. So the red circles here, they show what's happening during a 5 seconds cough over time. So the risk that is estimated here by the model will be, the equilibrium will be reached quite soon, after about 20 seconds after the cough. Whereas 1 minute speaking will actually increase over time the risk, and the equilibrium will be reached at a later time, of 80 seconds, and then we'll reach an equilibrium. So this was all modeled at a distance of 2.4 meter. Another figure that I would like to share is again where we have the maximum risk in the y-axis. Here we have risk as a function of separation. So here at the x-axis we have the separation in meters from the source, and there are different scenarios here displayed in this graph. So at the bottom we have a 10 seconds speaking, and the risk of at the receptor, which is quite low. Here at the top we have a scenario of 10 minutes speaking. So we see that the risk will decrease over distance, but still is very high at a distance of 4.8 meters. 1 minute speaking, then the risk drops quite fast, and a single cough as well. However, here when we look at the single cough, we see that the risk and maximum risk does not decreases very much in relation to the separation. So it's important that we distinguish this, how it's generated by what activity of the source, whether it's speaking or coughing. Another issue is of course that both the occupancy rate is important, especially in the indoor scenario and indoor situation. We all know that the CO2 concentration is an important parameter of the indoor air quality index, and it's also important because the CO2 concentration is related to the exhaled air of the occupants. And this is taken as a starting point for modeling risk, especially in the TB field. And it's an interesting paper that was published in 2015. So it's quite obvious that the number of occupants, room volume, and air ventilation will play a role with regard to the CO2 concentration. So this graph, which is taken from that particular paper that I showed you in the previous slide, shows that here at the point of time is 0, we have the ambient CO2 concentration, and it increases with the increase of occupants in a room over time. So the red and the blue line, they indicate different ventilation rates in liters per second here. This is another paper which shows the theoretical and the actual relationship between the CO2 concentration and the airflow rate, which is expressed here in units liter per seconds per person. So here we can see that when we have, say, a quite high airflow rate of about 10 liters, you would be able to reduce the CO2 concentration to about 1000 ppm. And that's also a little bit taken as a rule of thumb, that the CO2 concentration should be below 1000 ppm, which is also a little bit considered as a threshold for infection risk, and as a parameter or a proxy to indicate what is the what is the quality and the ventilation rate in a room. So especially in some scenarios where we have quite a long duration of exposure in a classroom, where we have some interactions by speaking, especially, but also when we have an index person or an infected person, we might have emissions like coughing and sneezing, and we might have a high level of occupancy in the room. The ventilation is quite key in this scenario. So the same authors that I already mentioned, like Stabile, Moravsky, and Buonanno, they came up with this quantitative risk assessment. They used it now for the potential risk in the classroom and the dependency on the ventilation, which is showed in one of their graphs. So here we have the individual risk in percentage on the y-axis. On the x-axis we have the air exchange rate, and here we have different scenarios. So this scenario T60LS means that a teacher is loudly speaking for 60 minutes. And then we have the teacher speaking just for 60 minutes, but not that loud. They also have modeled what the effect of a mask would be. So when we look at this, we see that this solid line shows the scenario and the risk related to a teacher loudly speaking for 60 minutes. They also modeled a minimum or threshold risk of about 5%. So, but anyhow, it shows here that at low air exchange rates, there's a quite high individual risk for infection, above 30%, and it only decreases when we have a air exchange rate of about 9, which is quite high. This is a little bit different for different scenarios. So this scenario, this 60 T60 SM shows this green here. So this is quite is below the say the thresholds already after about in about 2 exchanges per hour. The dotted line here shows the maximum CO2 concentration, and here it's already clear that the maximum concentration will be only below 1000 ppm, which is depicted on the right y-axis, at air exchange rates of about 6. So that's quite important to realize. We many say risk assessment models or matrices have been presented already. I just want to share this one by Jones, where they advocate a more flexible approach and looking at important parameters here, which are the activity of the which is related to the generation of the droplets. So they distinguish silent speaking and shouting or singing, and the second one is the occupancy of a room or in a scenario. They distinguish low and high occupancy, and then the ventilation, where they distinguish outdoors or well ventilated rooms, indoor and well ventilated, poorly ventilated. So it shows a more flexible approach than a standard 1.5 or 2 meter social distancing, or whatever. It shows the emission rate and a little bit what would be the loss of the generated or emitted droplets due to ventilation, and of course the occupancy says something about the CO2 concentration, and also it will probably affect the distance that people can actually adhere to. So this is more or less the end of the presentation. I would like to emphasize that the current rules, especially in the say 1 to 2 meters, are a little bit based on outdated science. There's quite some evidence that infection risk will exist beyond 2 meters distance. So non-pharmaceutical interventions should be risk-based, especially for in the scenario. So it should include at least issues related to occupancy, to ventilation, and to the activity that is responsible for the generation of particles. Ventilation is a key risk management measure. So this is a something where aerosol scientists say we need a shift in paradigm. So that this is just to demonstrate how important, especially in indoor situations, also workplaces, how important ventilation is. So then we see that over time, also in posters, it has evolved over time that ventilation is becoming an important factor also for awareness. Open windows for ventilation here in this poster. Fortunately, also the government and the regulations have acknowledged this, and in the current consolidated direction on occupational health and safety measures in certain workplaces, ventilation is mentioned as important. So thank you for listening, and the questions will be addressed later on in the seminar. Thank you so much, and I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. That was Professor Derk Brouwer on the historical basis of the aerosol droplet discussion. Quite an informative contribution. So, Professor, there's at least 3 questions that have already been typed in the question and answer box. Conal Bardenost, did the studies look at concentrations / dilution and probabilities? Then there's Nosipe Menzi asking, so I come across a video in one of the social media platforms of an old lady who said to have vaccinated from COVID-19 and later her left hand was numb, couldn't walk properly. Basically, she's paralyzed. Now, my question is, I'm not sure if we can answer that question in today's webinar, Nosipe. I might have to redirect you to our email address as well as our hotline, so you could possibly speak to our colleagues from the occupational medicine section. And then there's a question by Peter Geddes. Can I assume safely that heavy breathing, as during exercise or dancing, would be treated similarly to shouting or singing in terms of the risk? And then there's, oh wow, there's 2 more. Nishkala Singh asking, from the presentation, it isn't clear on whether air around the open spaces need to be sanitized, I guess, is that question, or needs sanitizing. Then there's an anonymous attendee would prefer you to please identify ourselves so that we have a record of who's asking the questions and the presenters can relate to you. We have initially, anonymous is asking, we initially informed that the virus was not transmitted by airborne route. Is it correct to say that this is incorrect? And then there's Eleanor Roberts. So how does limiting of staff in an area relate to here, please, for example, rotation of staff? So Professor, if you could just look at those questions in the question answer box, it's the double speech bubble at the bottom. If you click on type answer, then you can respond there to the question from the individuals, and we can cover the questions again at the end for the broader audience. Thank you very much for your presentation. So our next presenter is dealing with the topic, practical implications and the measurement of ventilation in rooms. And this is done by Kevin Renton. And by way of introduction, just want to share with you a short bio sketch. Mr. Kevin Renton is a registered occupational hygienist with the South African Institute for Occupational Hygiene, SIO, and a visiting lecturer at WITS School of Public Health since July 2020. Okay, I think is that 2021? I'm not sure. That might be. I'm sure Kevin can correct that. Mr. Renton joined the National Center for Occupational Health, now the NIH, in 1986, carrying out lead in blood measurements on the laboratory benches of the analytical section. Mr. Renton's highest academic hurdle was a master's in industrial health at the University of Michigan. And in 2020, Mr. Renton was made a visiting lecturer at the Occupational Health Division of the WITS School of Public Health. There are some information about his academic qualifications. I'm going to skip that and going to ask Kevin just to unmute his microphone and to prepare to share his presentation slides, clicking the green share screen button at the bottom and maximizing the slide, selecting the presentation slide box only, and then maximizing it. In the meantime, whilst we are doing that, a reminder, please, if you could type your questions in the question answer box, do not type it in the chat box. The chat box are for general comments. There have been some admin questions. Yes, we do issue a general certificate of attendance to all attendees. For those who require the CPD online test, the link and password is emailed to everybody after the webinar, and those who belong to the accredited professional bodies can then access the online CPD test and complete the test there. It is automated, and a CPD attendance certificate is issued subject to successful completion of the online test. Okay, so that's just some of the admin. There we go. Thank you very much, Kevin. And just to check your audio,
Yep.
I
Hi,
can hear
everybody.
you.
Okay.
Great. So I immediately hand over to you. Thank you for taking the time to prepare and share your information with our attendees, and for taking the time to present today. Much appreciated. In the meantime, just a quick reminder to Prof just to have a look at the questions in the question and answer box. Thanks. Over to you, Kevin.
Hi, thank you, Ashraf, for the introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit less technical, but I really enjoyed Professor Brewer's uh, presentation and about the 27 meters that a small particle which could be infected could go. That's all, of course, theoretically with computational, fluid dynamic, and fancy maths and computers. I'm going to talk about something more down to earth and more fun, which I think occupational hygienists like to do, which is measurement and some issues around that. In the screen, you can see one of the laboratories, the computer lab, which we measured and with fans, and Marguerite van Pullen standing by. Let's get to the next slide. I think I just have to click. Okay. So first of all, why ventilation? I think Derk Brouwer has more or less explained that. And this is the structure that I'm going to spend the next few minutes, hopefully few, it depends how fast I can go. The effectiveness of ventilation, some theory about it, how we actually measured it, and results and discussion and conclusion from a study at the School of Public Health at WITS. During COVID times, because we couldn't do anything else, we couldn't teach properly, still can't teach properly online, nothing like face-to-face to transfer information. So I would like you to, when you look at the slides coming up, a lot of them will be designed for face-to-face, where I actually ask questions and ask people to think about it. So please also, when you see the slides, think about the slide being shown, so as you can let it sink in and inwardly digest, as my chemistry teacher used to say at school. So research over the last 2 years, over 2 years, I should say. This was about 2015 in a paper from Oklahoma area in America, showed that there was an association between classroom ventilation rates and student performance in maths and reading, and of a rate of about 0.4. So the higher your reading score was, the higher the ventilation was. So people can concentrate better. Exactly how that works, of course, is probably very complicated. The ventilation rate was also associated with the mean number of visits to a school nurse during respiratory due to respiratory symptoms. So, obviously it's an issue that really we should have been dealing with properly from a long time ago, to provide good air, and possibly outside is even best. So here's a slide that shows what's actually happening in the situation, where somebody's talking, different size of particles, and if you wear a mask, you're protecting the others by reducing the source. So what's the solution to this? Is ventilation dilution. That is the solution. And so what that actually means is Let's just see if I, I wasn't expecting that one. This is the one I wanted. Is that you've got the air going in to a room and air going out. And the concentration will be a function of the emission, which is the E in this calculation, in this equation, the emission, and in a certain volume, which is the amount of air and volume per second, and the emission is also per second, so it cancels out and it will give you a concentration. Of course, we don't really know what the concentration that is dangerous in terms of bacteria and viruses, and that is something that is going to be an evolving field, I think, especially after COVID. There is quite a few things going on already before COVID, with TB being one of the issues, or one of the diseases that is also spread very predominantly by, or can be spread by aerosols. And so this equation, it's very simplified, but the issue is the mixing is what we're interested in to provide good ventilation. If we don't mix, we're not going to remove the air from every single little point in that room effectively. And so I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of ventilation. I think that's what I wanted to say about that. And then if you go, this other equation is pretty much the same, but we're talking about quanta emission of viruses and the airflow rate in meters per second, and then the equilibrium concentration. So the equilibrium is very, very determined by on the mixing, but because of, and we'll go into more detail later on. I'm sorry, you have to go through the mixing again. This being an automatic thing. So what is the types of ventilation that exists under the heading general dilution? So infiltration through the gaps in windows, if they're not closed, how far open are the windows? Quite often I go into an office and I see that it doesn't have a latch which can hold the window open at to different points. And then of course you get mechanical ventilation, and the favorite one is just recycling the air. It doesn't actually supply any fresh air, just controls the temperature. And one should always have the windows open a little bit as well to provide fresh air when relying on that. The outside winds makes a big difference to the amount of infiltration and leakage. And of course, it's not controllable. Unless you're very lucky and you've got windows on either side, and you can actually open each one in different situations each day. And then there's forced mechanical, which provides energy. With energy, it sorts out supply of air. I hope this is not too basic for you. So here's some examples, hypothetical examples of dilution ventilation. In this case, you've got the students in the front where you are, and the teacher behind, and the air supply going across the students. It's fine for the students, but the teacher is not getting a lot of fresh air. At the teacher's side, there's a higher pressure because the speed of the air in that area of the room is lower, and wherever you have high speed in the air, you create a low pressure. And that's what actually makes airplanes fly, or the feeling when you two cars pass in the road in opposite directions, you can feel the pull, especially to a big truck, inwards, and that pull inwards is caused by the high speed causing a low pressure. And the high pressure where the teacher is doesn't get any air. That was Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli is a very interesting character. He was one of a family of 200 Bernoullis, over the years, and they were all geniuses in Italy. I think I'm very grateful to him. I think having aeroplanes flying is due to him to a large extent. So we need to look at the arrangement in each in a room, and so I'm going through a few of them. So this is where you're supposed to think. Okay, so it's also going to flash the good or poor ventilation. Okay, so I helped you with that one. Next one, I'm going to delay a little bit and look at this one. Now here, this is the arrangement that was at the School of Public Health, where air is being supplied by a fan on the left-hand side and then being withdrawn or just passively on the right-hand side, just by having a vent to allow air to exit. And if you can think, this one is obviously going to favor the opposite of the previous one, which is the teacher. And most of the air is going to go towards the teacher. Following the pathway is a critical thing in exposure science to work out what is actually happening. So let's go to the next one, or that's that one. And then, so now there's one that supplies from the floor, which looks like a much better arrangement. The teacher and the students are going to get some good air, good fresh air supplied from the bottom, and the warmth from the students and the teacher as well will cause the air to rise, and it will, so there should be a positive effect of the heat generated by students and teacher. So this is probably the best arrangement. Of course, you're going to have to balance the fans. If the fan at the top is exiting and the fan at the bottom is pushing air in, you have to not have a negative pressure, which will attract in dust and things from outside. So your outside, your roof fan shouldn't be taking more air out than is being supplied at the bottom. These look like very fancy systems. I'm not sure if they exist anywhere. This is really hypothetical. Okay, so here, good or poor design, what would you say? So I think it's quite good, except that if your teacher's sick, then everybody's going to get sick. And of course, the students at the back of the class who are usually sleeping, they're going to have a worst case because they will get possibly infected by the students in front of them and the teacher. That's an example also where the pathway needs to be looked at. We like the term exposure pathways in exposure science. And next one, just working on a, so now it's more or less the same, except the air is being supplied downwards. Okay, so that's the theory part, most of the theory part. So this is the action that we did with some students, Marguerite and Zama and Prof Brouwer. And our objectives were to measure the air changes per hour. So this is the same as the air exchange rate that Derk was talking about. It's just a different term. It's the amount of air that goes into the room and measured in the volume of the room. So you were any air going in, you will divide by the volume of the room, and you'll get the number of air changes in that room of the air supply. So it's a measure of the ventilation going in. And then where there was mechanical air supplied, we measured the ventilation effectiveness. So how much of that air supplied was actually being effective at removing contaminants. In this case, we had a tracer of CO2. And then from guidelines, we estimated the maximum room occupancy. So we'll go into the details of that. And provide, then at the end, provide recommendations to minimize the risk for a safe return to campus, which we're still hoping for. So let's see. We used the ventilation standard we used was 10 liters per second per person, which is, just get my notes here, which is sort of a standard figure that is quite high relative to how much is normally supplied. Fisk and Bremer, which is quoted in this paper, below on the slide, did a study of economics as well as the health effects. So they looked at, I think, just they were looked in terms of absenteeism, of the cost of providing air, and warming the air as well. If in winter, there's quite a big cost to provide fresh air, and they came up with 10 liters per second, which was also adopted by World Health Organization for in the context of COVID-19. So they were looking more at health effects from indoor contaminants, formaldehyde in the carpets and the furniture, and other chemicals that are possibly used, cleaning chemicals. And so it's not exactly comparable to viruses, but it's somewhere to start. And as we'll see, well, it is fairly arbitrary. And seeing as we don't know what safe levels are, and there's not enough research done to find what they are, it's better we just hang on one of them and then see how we go. So it's important to say it's not really a safe ventilation limit. Don't think that 10 liters per second per person, it will protect you. And especially looking at Derk's presentation and the variety of things of movement that could be different size particles can move to different distances, it's going to be quite a complex sum at the end of the day. So there's ways to measure ventilation rate using CO2. And that's first the rate of increase generated by students, or final steady concentration after you've released a known amount of CO2. Or in the case of this paper, which I found dealt with all three methods, they relied on the CO2 being released by the students, and worked out where the equilibrium concentration was, and from that calculate the air changes, the amount of air coming into the room. So this was a study of 220 classrooms that in the United States, and then they also used the method of the CO2 decay after they leave. So the ventilation is still on. As when the students leave, then it will decrease. We'll get onto that now. So this is the build-up method, just one of the results that they reported in this paper. And from the increase, which is pretty exponential, well, from that increase, mathematically work out how much fresh air is coming in. And there's the steady state method, which works out how much is being, the 95 percentile concentration is taken as the maximum steady state, where the amount of fresh air coming in and the amount of CO2 generated by the students is a steady, not really steady. They go out to break, I think, a few times, and that's the whole day at school. So the way that the method that we chose was a decay curve, where we actually injected CO2 and measured the decrease, and from that rate of decrease, which is an exponential decrease, we calculated how much fresh air was coming in to a particular room. So looking at the variability that they found on their in their study, you could see the three different methods. The build-up method seemed to have a lot of variability. Decay method, not so much. Steady states in between. But this doesn't really tell you much because we don't know the accuracy of the method, and there's no standard method which we would say is your reference method. It's just to give you an idea of what the ranges were that they found in liters per second per person. So you can see some classrooms had a lot of effective air, 22 liters per second per person. And so using a different method, you could have got a quarter of that, if in fact that was comparable. I don't, Ashraf, can you see the caption? Because on my screen I can't. Does everybody see the caption from the paper of uncertainty? Or
Yes, we can.
You can see it, okay.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I've got my notes as well, so I can look at them. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of how they worked on those schools. That was actually done in spring or something. I can't see it. Okay, so anyway, not important. So what we did at the School of Public Health was we chose 10 common or shared rooms, meeting and lecture rooms, including a lift and a restroom. And we measured the amount of fresh air coming in under worst and best case conditions. That is with windows and doors closed. That was initially, and then open. And obviously opened is best case condition. Our protocol was like this: windows and doors closed. Then we released the tracer gas, CO2, from a fire extinguisher. Then 3 desks fans were used to mix CO2 until it was evenly distributed, as determined by CO2 monitoring. The fans were then switched off, and the monitor was left in the middle of the room at 1.2 meters from the floor. These are standards that ASHRAE gives about where in the room, where you should measure and where is the fresh air going to. As you can imagine from the previous slides of the different arrangements in a room, that no one particular point in the room is the same as any other point. So we used the center of the room as being the index point to be able to compare. Ideally, you would like to have about 6 or 10 or more CO2 monitors at different points in the room to get a comprehensive idea of how much fresh air is getting into the room. So then after we switched the fans off and then left for 30 minutes to see what natural leakages were into the room or out the room. And then we opened, after 30 minutes, we opened windows and continued to see how much fresh air is coming into the room, or air is being supplied by the ventilation system. So here are the rooms that, this is on the left is a room, lecture room 1 and 2, which has got no, they have no windows, just doors, and the air supply you can see from Whirly, from in the roof there's little like radiating circles. That's air which gets supplied. It's called a swirl something. I've forgotten. And on the right is a typical toilet air supply with you can spin that disc in the center and adjust the air that comes into the bathroom. So our first step is to do a qualitative assessment. So is there any air movement? And here's Marguerite puffing some smoke, and you can't see it really, but that smoke wasn't going anywhere. You could see it slowly spreading out there. I think with the higher concentration in the center, and whereas the outside periphery is slightly less. So that also we're looking at the pathway. Where is the air going to? To get the amount of air coming into the room, ideally we would use a bolometer to get this figure of the amount of air. And we didn't have a bolometer, but we used an anemometer along the ridges, along the ventilation slots, and took many measurements to calculate it. Of course, measuring also the height of the room, the length and the width to get the volume. So there you get your air changes, is the air volume per hour in a room. So the total amount going in divided by the total room volume, and you get, that gives you the number per hour. The next step is to let the CO2 go, and with fans spread it around the room. We arranged the fans in 3 directions to try and help spread them evenly. This is the fun part. It's fun to let a fire extinguisher go. Don't know if you've ever done that. And of course, you have to get the amount of air spread evenly around. And then after that, you monitor it, a continuous monitoring. It's actually every 5 seconds, this Q-Track records the concentration, and you can download it. And so now this is slightly out of sequence. I should go back to that. So there's downloading it and analyzing it with Daniel and myself. So just to explain how we calculated the air changes from the the slope of the decrease of CO2, is that I won't go into the mathematics. I remember learning it as an integration of 1 over x when I was at school. But this curve is described by that equation C, which is the concentration at any point, and C0 is the concentration that you start at. I haven't got a, well, I don't, can you see my screen? My pointer options, maybe pointer. Yeah. Okay, so there's the initial concentration, which just in an Excel sheet, I put in 900. And the, the E function is the natural logarithm, and to the power of minus the air changes times time follows this curve. Okay, that's really all you need to know. This is the time in seconds. So that would be up to like 10 minutes or so, 10 minutes here. And if you've got 1 air change per hour, okay, that's this on the right-hand side, and 1.5 air changes per hour, it shows you how the concentration decreases. So at first, you can't really see that exponential decrease, but as you increase the power of the E function, you'll see the curve drop precipitously quickly. So 20 air changes per hour gives you quite a nice drop in a short time, in like 5 minutes. It gets down to quite low. And this is above, these are all above ambient being 400 about. So this is an artificial graph from Excel. Okay, so I hope that's clear. C0, I don't know if it's if you can see all the right things there, but you can ask questions later. I can always come back to this slide. Okay, so next, so I have to see next slide. Okay, and I've already talked about this. And here's a real result that we got out of the lab measurement in the computer lab that we saw. And you can see how initially the CO2 was 1800 about, and then it decreased quite a lot. And this was while the CO2 is being spread around. And later we adjusted our method to walking around with the CO2 meter until we got a normal, I think, and not 100%, but walking around until we got a steady level. And then we let go and started measuring. And here we opened the windows and doors, and now you can see a nice exponential decrease. And from that, we calculated the air changes. So I'm going to have to next every time, or I can try and use my computer. So now the ventilation effectiveness, although you're getting all this air being supplied, not all of it is responsible for taking out contaminants. So because of it's a large area, and in the way that the previous slides I showed you with the theoretical thing, some of the air reaching the teachers, some reaching the students, because it's widely variable as to how long the air lasts actually in any one place. And there's a new term called the age of the air, which people are using these days in different points in the room. So we get this is the effective outside air. So this is the volume of air change that we calculated from the CO2 decrease. So that was like the how effective the air that we're supplying is actually doing at reducing the CO2 level. And then the total amount of air that was supplied, which we do with the bolometer or with the anemometer, that is always much higher. So this percentage will be less than 100 if it's not perfect. And we measured at the center, as I said before. So these are the results. So in the resource center, which is quite a big area, takes 144 people, you'll see later. And we found air changes per hour of 2. And with the theoretical amount that's actually coming through the ceiling, it was also 2, so we had 100% effectiveness. Even though 4 of the 6 suppliers were not working. I mean, we were working, only 2 were not working. And we left the double door and window, high windows you couldn't reach open, which would improve the mixing. So that explains why you'll get 100%. One of the reasons was that that's how we normally use the room. So we would actually choose to leave it as it was normally being used. In lecture room 1 and 2, that's one with no windows, and 2 of the 8 supply registers were not working. There we saw effectiveness of only about 26%. Now, lecture room 4 was an interesting case where there was a lot of air. There was a lot of air. Students were getting dressed up with blankets and things in winter because there's just so much air being supplied there, and you can see 14 air changes per hour of actual air supplied. But the effectiveness in terms of CO2 decay was only 39%. And we did it twice, once with the windows closed, and then once with the windows open. You can see the effectiveness increased to 54%. And definitely things were working there. So the ladies' restroom, where we didn't have fans, so we flapped the doors, John and I, to get the mixing, and that seemed to be quite nicely mixed. And it was a decent air supply, 3.3 air changes per hour. And the north lift, which we did as well, had a very low percentage effectiveness. I think it's possibly due to the dead ceiling space above the fan, which just sits inside the lift, and it doesn't really supply fresh air. So I missed out something there, but we can deal with it later if necessary. So this was our occupancy calculated from either the social distancing of 2 meters or the ventilation requirement of 10 liters per second per person. So you could work out how many liters were coming in and divide it by 10 liters per second and per person, and that gives you the number of people. So by social distancing, you could have 151 people in the resource center. It's quite a lot, but because of the ventilation wasn't ideal, we could only allow 44 people to come into the room according to the 10 liters per second standard. Computer lab, where the ventilation was very bad, as I said earlier, that smoke just didn't go anywhere. But there were 33 that could have been there according to social distancing, but only 9 given the ventilation. The lecture room half was the 1 and 2 could have had 87, but because of poor maintenance, it's only allowed 29. Lecture room 3, this was the room we had windows open on either side of one's in the courtyard and one was outside the building. So the actual air was quite nicely going right through that lecture room 3. And it had very good ventilation, even though the ventilation itself wasn't working. we got 30 were allowed through social distancing. Lecture room 4, which was a freezing cold one, it was the ventilation was so good that social distancing became the determinant. So 20 people is about all you can really fit in there anyway. So these two rooms were quite good if you wanted to choose a room in the School of Public Health. The AV audiovisual room could have taken 13, but because of ventilation issues, only 9. And the postgraduate room, only 7, and 8, also limited by the ventilation. And meeting rooms as well. And I can't see the north lift. But if there's any things, I think you might be getting bored with this now. So in conclusion, we decided that the occupancy numbers would, with 10 liters per second, World Health Organization guidance, would allow fewer occupants than using the 2-meter social distancing. So just see that. So so the 10 liters per second was actually saying, okay, 44, but the World Health, at least the social distancing, is 151. So there's quite a big difference. It's like a third. So that was a more stringent standard to follow, was the ventilation, which is understandable because, especially considering what Derk Brouwer was saying, that the particles, the aerosols can go very far, and possibly even the droplets can go further than people think. Using that arbitrary of 5 micron, I mean, you could never get a droplet 5 micron. It's tiny, tiny. It's going to float. Okay, so that ventilation can be reasonably easy to measure using CO2 mixing and CO2 decay monitoring, at least at the center point. And it's not too difficult. The cheap CO2 sensors are available. And improving the ventilation may contribute significantly to reduction of exposure. So that I think is almost like logical given. Maybe, though, it's not proved. We didn't prove anything in this respect. But our recommendations are to improve maintenance, so the greater students can use the facilities, improve window use, which together with other exposure control elements. So the ventilation on its own doesn't do everything. You need to still do all the other things to limit infection. And then, of course, a maintenance priority list should be considered to manage repair and ventilation equipment in the poorly ventilated rooms as funds become available. I want to leave some questions for afterwards. So this is just a demonstration of a real life building where you can see the shortcut ventilation exit is there and the supply is here. So the guy sitting at the table in the boardroom in this case are not getting protected at all, or very little. And I think then that will be this is something Ireland is apparently very forward in dealing with COVID, and practical steps for good ventilation in schools is an article that's probably worthwhile reading, especially if you're at school. It's long, but it's got lots and lots of just basic common sense things that we do anyway, using outdoors and so on. And then I think that's the end. thanks very much for your time. I hope we get fresh air, more fresh air in the future.
Thank you very much for that, Kevin. I
Okay,
guess
stop sharing.
my
Shall I stop?
Eskimos, yes, stop sharing, screen sharing. Thanks. Yeah,
Okay.
my Eskimo suit here is exactly because of a bit of ventilation, and with the lowering of temperatures in Johannesburg, I've got to unfortunately lay up. Okay, so thank you very much. I mean, the message is absolutely crystal clear. Ventilation is critical, and I think your presentation slides, which the attendees will receive subsequently, were uploaded to our website. Some of the attendees have asked, and the links will be shared with everybody. We try to do all the post-webinar admin within the 24 to 48-hour period. That includes general attendance certificates, the CPD certificates, the links to you, as well as a post-webinar survey for your comments and suggestions for new recommended topics. That was Kevin Renton dealing with the practical implications and the measurement of ventilation in rooms, and looking at the different rooms that was dealt with at the WITS public school. Public health school. Okay, so we now have approximately 13 minutes. And in that 13 minutes, Kevin, I need to remind you just to visit the question and answer box. In that box, thanks, Prof has been quite actively busy answering questions there. Is some more questions for particularly you. And just to Saeed Rashida, please do not type general comments. You know, I understand that you are grateful and thankful for the answers provided there, but do not type general comments in the question and answer box. I'm going to just move that thank you that you've typed there out. Okay, so plus minus, there's about 8 questions. I see Prof is answering one. If you could just also deal with the questions there on that one, on the question and answer box, Kevin. Okay, so in this period, I'm going to perhaps ask Prof if there's any particular questions that have been asked already, which he thinks is important to share with the broader audience, asked and answered already. And if he wants to raise any of those and highlight any of those questions that have been raised there. So, Professor, if you could just join by unmuting the microphone and just giving us an idea. You've answered quite a bit of the questions there already. What's the trend look like, and what are some of the important highlights that arise out of those questions for you, Prof?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I think the issue is that say many of the existing rules, non-pharmaceutical intervention rules, are of course a simplification of a more complex reality. So if we say 2 meters distance or whatever, that is a simplification, and I understand, because especially with regard to the general public, the message should be not that complicated. But assuming we are professionals, I think that a more flexible approach and also a flexible risk assessment is important. So I don't think there are recommendations that say, okay, instead of 2 meters, 4 meters is a safe distance. No, I think the message is, the bottom line of the presentation is that there are quite a number of parameters or determinants of infection risk which are related to the source. So what does a source person actually do with regard to activity? What is the emission rate? Is he shouting or coughing or just breathing? What is the level of exertion of that particular person? But also, what are the environmental conditions for the transport, what is the ventilation in the room, the occupancy rate, and then of course what is the receptor, what is the activity level of the receptor, etc. So there is no one answer. The bottom line, I think, is that there should be a scenario specific risk assessment, which then could lead to recommendations by the professional. So I showed you that particular risk matrix that was developed by Jones. I think it should be more or less, and of course, a risk matrix is also a simplification, but it gives more guidance on what are the important factors that we should consider. So I think that would be, I think, the answer to a number of questions that were focused on what is a safe distance, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. So just to check, this is the matrix that you're referring to by Jones? Oh, okay. I'm not sure if I'm sharing the right screen there. I think it's this one over here. So, Prof, is that the matrix you're referring to by Jones, 2020? Okay, I think you may need to unmute.
Yeah, okay, this is correct.
Yeah.
This is actually where I'm referring to. And yeah, I think it's quite nice, although it's not really comprehensive enough, but I think it's good guidance. So let's take into account that in here in the bold, say letters, which are the bold words here, said that this is for a short contact time. Yeah, so I think that's one of the limitations of this, because there might be scenarios where you have actually a long contact time.
Okay.
I already indicated that, for example, in a classroom, you might have long contact time. So, but anyhow, so if you look at the short contact time for which this scheme has been developed, we see that on the one hand, on the left hand, we see the different issues that are relevant for the emission rate. So what actually is the potential infected person? What is his activity with regard to the emission? So is he silent, or is he speaking, or is he shouting, singing? So these are differences, because when you are silent, your emission rate is low. And then we have the issue that is related to the ventilation. And above that, there is a separation between low occupancy and high occupancy. And of course, this is also a little bit related to the shared air concept that was already explained by Kevin. So if you have an air exchange rate in a room, you actually will share the fresh air. So the more people in the room, the less fresh air per person. That is quite clear. So occupancy is also important, because it relates to the fresh air supply. And then, of course, the ventilation. This is a very rough grouping of ventilation, say outdoor, well ventilated or poor ventilated. So there should be more nuances in this, but as a starting point for a say first tier risk assessment, this might be very important. But I would like to really emphasize that a scenario specific risk assessment is important, and then of course based on that, scenario specific mitigation might be developed. There was also a question which is related to this. So if we have shared office spaces, is that different? Do we need rotation? Is it different from a single occupant office? Yes, of course, the preference would be that there is only one person in an office space. And that particular person, well, I mean, it's depending on who's going to visit them, but you can actually open windows, etc. In shared office spaces, you have actually that particular issue of the shared air. So ventilation is important here. And the occupancy is important because on one hand, it's the social distancing, and which is important, but also the shared air and the shared fresh air, especially. So I think this is a little bit related to Kevin's conclusions and the table he showed that depending on if you look at occupancy, then it's important to look at what is the most strict criterion that can be used, but do indeed take ventilation as an important criterion.
Okay, thank you very much. So just a reminder to Kevin as well for the question and answers. Apologies, I think I was muted and I spoke without opening my microphone. So just a reminder that there are some 6 questions still open in the question answer box. If Kevin could also just have a look there and answer some of the questions there, or if he wants to answer any of those questions live. There was a raised hand, but I think it's missing now. So if I could just quickly deal with the questions that have not yet been answered. So do we need to change air cons to have air circulation? And Kevin, I don't know if you want to perhaps touch on this, if you could open your microphone. I would assume that there's the issue of mechanical and natural ventilation here.
Yeah, no, I don't think you need to change. Besides, your boss is not going to let you change. They spent a lot of money on the air conditioning, and it's going to keep the temperature, control it, which is what you want. Then you don't have to wear Arctic clothes like Redcliffe has, like Ashraf has. But no, I would just make sure that you have some cross ventilation so that your window, or if you don't have an openable window, that could be an issue, but possibly you could get, a maintenance person to provide some form of cross ventilation so that your air, because you're pumping air in, it's recirculating it. So the pressures could, as long as you've got room, some communication for fresh air to come into the room. That's the most important thing. So open windows. Sometimes people put the door cut off a little bit underneath the door to allow air to come in through that, if you're going to close your doors.
Kevin, if I could just put the next question to you, and Prof
Yeah.
might want to add to this as well. There's a question, what can be regarded as low occupancy and what can be regarded as high occupancy?
Well, I think you have to calculate it according to standard of 10 liters per second of fresh air per person.
Okay, so it's the necessary formulas can be applied in order to determine what the numbers would be, and then one can, I guess, rate that. Thanks for that. There's a question for Prof Derk there, and then is it therefore correct to conclude? This is from Joseph Mosia. Apologies. Joseph Mosia. Is it therefore correct to conclude that during presentations in meetings and facilitations, everybody is sitting down? It's much safer if all protocols are followed. Kevin?
Well, it depends. You see, each room is different. Quite often, it could be like that could be true. But it depends. Like you'd have to go into that room and puff some smoke and see where smoke is going. And obviously, you wouldn't be able to do that with people there, but you'd have to, investigate the air flow in any particular room and make recommendations.
Yeah, and I would assume that the nature of ventilation is also important. Is it airflow across, and where the inlets and the outlets are. So I think, Joseph, the point is that it depends on the specifics of the venue and the room and the ventilation there. And I think Kevin is recommending that an assessment be done. Would that be correct, Kevin?
Yeah, and what is the air that's coming? Is it outside air? Is it fresh outside air? As VJ was talking about, and I was just trying to think of an answer to the second part of his question. He says, we've got to consider the contaminants that could be coming out through into the room. Sometimes the buildings will draw their fresh air from the parking lot underground, which is not ideal, or too close to the traffic higher up next to the road. So you have to look at, quite often you find pigeons contributing to the contaminants drawn into so-called fresh air. So I think every building should have a manager who looks after, and I don't think you need to be particularly clever or qualified. Just logical stuff could improve the quality in all rooms.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Well, so there was an important study that was published on the outbreak in a restaurant. I think it was in Shanghai, where actually the ventilation and especially the recirculation by fans, etc., played an important role in the infection, and therefore I think it is very important that we don't focus on a single single issue like the 10 liters per second per person only, but also indeed look at the quality of the air, and that we try to avoid these desk fans, which only enhances the dispersion rather than actually doing what is needed, is to supply with fresh air. So I think we should be very keen that we don't just focus on a single issue or a single value, but we have to be more comprehensive and looking at the specific scenario.
Thanks, Prof. We are slightly beyond our time by a couple of minutes, and we'll be closing soon. And I guess the other key point I got from both of you is that whilst we're examining in quite detail a important measure, and that's ventilation and how it protects and prevents potential exposure, the other measures, which is masking and the distancing and so on, that's also come out of the discussion, is obviously also critical as a combination of measures that collectively would contribute to protecting employees, students, in the case of the work that was done by Kevin, etc., in rooms and so on. We are in the final minute or two. And I see that Prof and Kevin is dealing with the last two open questions in the question and answer box there. Whilst they're busy with that, in a moment, I'm going to just ask them for very final remarks, closing remarks. I just want to thank all of you as attendees for being here. And I hope that the webinar has been very useful for you in the roles you play within your workplaces, and in the buildings where your colleagues and fellow employees are occupied, and whatever services you may be providing to employers and to workplaces. I think it's critical the contribution we can make as attendees to the COVID-19 and occupational health and safety preparedness and prevention in our workplaces. Okay, so we are not going to encourage you to type any more questions. We have run out of time. Your questions might not be able to be answered in the next minute or two. Glenador Jansen, okay, well, that's a stay, thank you. And then Niskala Singh, apologies, was referring to aerosol dispensers, and my sense is that Prof has actually answered that question earlier. So at this point in time, I need to say thank you very much to our two presenters, our guest presenters, and that's Professor Derk Brouwer, who dealt with the historical basis of the aerosol droplet discussion. He's a distinguished professor in occupational hygiene and health at the School of Public Health at WITS. And secondly, Kevin Renton, who dealt with the practical implications and measurements of ventilation in the room. So Prof and Kevin, 30 seconds each, max. Final comments, take-home message to our attendees. Prof?
Well, yeah, I only would like to encourage the participants being say professionals in this field of occupational health and safety to encourage them to look at specific scenarios and be as specific as possible with regard to your risk assessment and your risk mitigation recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kevin, final words from you?
I would agree with Prof Derk Brouwer. It's also each case should be judged on its own merits, but it's common sense. Fresh outside air, virus is killed by oxygen and sunlight, and quite a few chemicals, things kill viruses. So yeah, just go for some fresh air. Work outside if you can. But I have to start getting philosophical and talk about do you need this at all anyway? But anyway, thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much again to both our presenters and for our attendees for your attendance. And we will see you on the next webinar. Our next webinar that's going to be delivered by the NIOH, and I'm just unfortunately don't have my, oh, there I found it, is dealing with the COVID-19 occupational health services in the workplace. And we will be circulating that particular invitation hopefully sometime later today. So thank you very much to our presenters. Take care and stay safe, and see you on our next webinar. Goodbye.